Hello, and welcome to Bedtime Stories. We're going to be reading Chapter 7 from The King's Messenger by Carolyn, Clare Gibbons, and illustrated by Stephen Hesselman. This is what the cover looks like. We're going to start with a quote from Paradise Lost by John Milton. "This is my long sufferance and my day of grace. They who neglect and scorn shall never taste, but hard be hardened and blind be blinded more, that they may stumble on and deeper fall, and none but such from mercy I exclude." From Paradise Lost, John Milton. Moving on to Chapter 7, The King's Justice. "He is coming!" The man burst into the courtroom, his voice tinged with fear. Smuggins heard the news along with everyone else. The man had heard the word from a shopkeeper who had heard it from a lamplighter. The word had spread through the city like heat ahead of the coming fire. The king's enemy has arrived. The messenger stood a little straighter, and Smuggins practiced in his head, "At your service, your majesty. Yes, your majesty," so that he wouldn't forget the proper form. Who knew what the king would need from his messengers when his enemy arrived? Smuggins had fought the enemy once and knew his strength. He'd also tried to infiltrate a group of his followers and knew the enemy's persuasive power. The king might call on his messengers for anything. Everyone in the courtroom was abuzz with the news. "He carries a green branch of armistice. They say he comes alone. I wonder if he's going to give his loyalty to the king. Shouldn't he be carrying a white flag? The king was certainly victorious in their last encounter, except that he let the enemy go. I still don't understand why he did that." "Don't you see?" The king offered his forgiveness, and now the enemy is coming to accept it. At the front of the courtroom, apart from the chattering, fidgeting crowd, the king sat alone on his throne. Smuggins watched him carefully and could see a whole range of emotions cross his face. There was a ray of hope, a moment of nostalgia, a sigh of grief. Even the king did not know what the enemy's visit would afford. Suddenly, the king's stillness spread throughout the room. Horse hooves could be heard clattering in the courtroom, and the jangle of harnesses. Smuggins could imagine the tall form of the king's enemy stepping off his horse, holding high the green branch that was his only protection from attack. A moment later, the image in Smuggins's mind presented itself in the doorway, the tall, dark figure of the king's enemy, unarmed, carrying a green branch before him. He walked the length of the courtroom and stopped in front of the dais. He did not kneel, but stood before the king's throne with his head held high. The king did not rise and did not speak his usual words of welcome. "Your Majesty," the king's enemy said in a mocking tone. "Yes? I come before you today with an accusation," the enemy stated. The king did not reply at first. He seemed a little surprised at his enemy's statement. Finally, he spoke. "Against whom?" "Smuggins, your messenger." Smuggins's heart skipped a beat. Every eye in the king's courtroom turned to look at him. As if dodging a physical blow, he took a step backward. This was not a strategy he'd expected. Was the enemy trying to blame his betrayal on Smuggins somehow? Was he trying to convince the king that Smuggins was his true enemy? The king looked back at his enemy. "Shall I call him forward that you may make your accusation?" he asked, in a tone so calm that Smuggins felt a cold hand of fear grip his heart. Okay, let's redo that. "Shall I call him forward so that you can make your accusation?" he asked in a tone so calm that Smuggins felt a cold hand of fear grip his heart. "If you wish," the enemy said, nonchalantly. The king turned back to the wall of messengers. "Smuggins, step forth," he said. Never had Smuggins's step been so tentative. Never had he answered the king's call with more fear in his heart. He did not know what accusation the enemy had to bring against him, but he worried that the king would be persuaded by his oldest friend. His voice nearly cracked with the tension as he said, "At your service, your majesty." The king addressed his enemy. "What have you to say against my messenger?" "That he is a coward who fails in the tasks that you give him," the enemy replied. "Explain your accusation," the king commanded, standing. "When you sent this messenger to the north, and the task was intended for him was to strike a blow at my forces. Instead, after fighting me, he turned coat and ran away, never stopping to look back. When you sent him to the south to infiltrate a group of my followers, he not only failed to do so, but his action so inflamed the group against you that they are now the strongest support I have in your kingdom, save my personal guard. This messenger of yours is no more your servant than I. His actions have consistently worked against you." Smuggins knew there was truth in the enemy's words. When the king sent him to the north, perhaps he should have stayed and fought with the enemy against the enemy's forces. When the king sent him to the south, his failure in his task had repercussions throughout the kingdom. His eyes wide, he looked to the king's face again, hoping he would not have to speak in his own defense. There was no way he could refute the enemy's charges. The king looked again at Smuggins, as if considering the enemy's accusations and weighing them in his mind. The silence in the courtroom was deafening. Smuggins knew everyone waited for the king's judgment. Finally, the king spoke again, still looking at Smuggins. "The words you say have some truth in them. My messenger has not served me without fault." The king's enemy stood even taller than before and held his head higher with pride. He started to speak. The king cut him off abruptly. "But," he said, looking his enemy in the eye, "but these charges against my messenger are not new. They have been brought against him before, and I have offered him forgiveness. You say he is no more my servant than you, but I counter that he has served me with all the humility in his heart. I have forgiven him, and his failures can no longer be held against him. Any fault in him I take as my own, and take whatever repercussions his failures have as my own responsibility." Smuggins took a deep breath, his first since the king had turned away. He felt weak all over, as if he barely had the strength to stand any longer. The king turned back to him. "Smuggins," he said, "my messenger, you may step back." "Yes, your majesty," Smuggins said, and stepped back until he could feel the wall behind him for support. The king returned to his enemy. "Have you any more accusations?" he asked. The enemy was somewhat chastened. "No," he answered. "Then I have business with you," the king said. "I made you an offer when we last met, and I have yet to hear your response." The king's enemy scoffed. "Do you really think I would accept such an offer? You should have killed me when you had the chance, but like a fool, you simply asked the impossible, my loyalty to you. I give my loyalty to no one but myself, for I alone have the power, fortitude, and force necessary for respect. Is this your answer? You set yourself against me once and for all?" The enemy spoke again, each word precise and deliberate. "I will never serve." A single tear slipped down the king's cheek as he spoke again. "You have long acted as my enemy, but today you have made an enemy of me." Without another word, the king's enemy turned on his heel and strode out of the courtroom. Everyone watched him go. They heard him mount his horse in the courtyard and ride away. No one looked back at the days until the silence left in the enemy's wake was broken by a sob. Smuggins quickly turned back to the throne, where the king sat with his head in his hands, his body racked with sobbing. The king's torrent of grief spent itself after a time, and he stood to face the courtiers in his courtroom. "My oldest friend has today defied me to my face. I offered him forgiveness, and he set himself against me. There can be no more hope of reconciliation. No more thoughts of a bright future. The king's brother, the royal prince, stepped forward from the crowd. "My good brother," he said, "surely you knew this from the start, when he first stood against you." The king looked over the line of messengers. "Smuggins, step forward," he said. "At your service, your majesty," Smuggins said, stepping out. "What do you say to what has passed between us today? How do you view my words?" "Your majesty, you offered me the only true gift, forgiveness, and today you stood before me and took the accusation that should have been mine. How can I feel anything but gratitude?" The king smiled a wan smile. "Thank you, Smuggins. You may step back." "Yes, your majesty," Smuggins said. The king turned back to the royal prince, who still stood waiting for an answer. "These are the words I long to hear from my enemy, but instead he has chosen to venerate himself. His evil is a cancer in my kingdom, and it must be removed. I weep for my loss, but he has determined his own end." "This is just, my lord," the royal prince said. Smuggins nodded in agreement, and the king saw. "Aye," the king replied, nodding his head slowly along with Smuggins. "It is just to repay disobedience with punishment. But to those who choose to serve me, I offer mercy in place of retribution." What we learn from the story is that Smuggins made a mistake, and he was sorry, and he committed to serving the king, and the king forgave him. But then the king's friend, this enemy, they made a mistake, and they rebelled against the king, and they weren't sorry about it, and they refused to serve the king any longer. And so the king, sadly, had to separate himself from a very old friend, a close friend. This is a good story about forgiveness. Smuggins was forgiven, and he was able to serve the king with all that he had.